Chapter 27, The United Nations of Red Flags. Workplaces can be tricky. Sometimes we walk into an environment that feels perfect, only to discover months later that the cracks were there all along. The toxic energy, the dysfunction, the exhaustion, it was all simmering beneath the surface. How do we know when it's time to step back and look at the bigger picture? When do those small signs, the ones that we brush off as normal stressors, turn into glaring red flags? Today, we're diving into the United Nations of Red Flags. I call it that because no matter where you are, no matter what industry you're in, workplace toxicity speaks a universal language. The signs of trouble are all the same. And if we're not paying attention, those red flags will eventually catch up with us. What are these red flags, and how do we recognize them before it's too late? More importantly, how do these universal issues manifest across different industries? As we embark on today's conversation, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about where you work, and I want you to ask yourself if you've recognized any of these red flags. And if you have, I want you to ask yourself a very simple question. Is it worth it? From the Hyman brand, I'm JD Hyman. As a Black man living here in America, I am living proof that while all men were created equal, not all men are equal. We're here to dig into the American political system, explore and unearth experiences from the human condition, and be a catalyst for some hard conversations that need to be had. No matter what brought you here, I'm glad you came. Once again, my name is JD, and this is the Hyman Podcast. Part 1, in which we find our voice. It has been said that toxic leaders all have hallmark traits, a set of nearly universal characteristics that for some reason or another, they all seem to share. Doing this podcast, I've been able to dwindle down the cause and reason, and for some reason, it seems to be this one simple thing: control. I guess a God complex can do that to a person. I've brought it up several times, but now I want to dive into it a little more. What are the actual effects of toxic leadership on the workplace and on the individuals within the workplace? Because in typical fashion, most of the time, we don't recognize the red flags or the toxic leaders until it's too late.
I think that I sometimes think about factions, like that's a strong word, but really like something where you come into a workplace and so you interview and you talk to their top people usually, and then all of a sudden you get in and you realize that there's some dynamics going on that you couldn't have been aware of, and there was already layers of toxicity occurring, and you just slide into it, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this isn't at all what was sold to me as what this was, or it was just sort of glossed over when they knew. Once you get in, they're like, oh, yeah, it's always been like that. We're trying to change it. Or, yeah, like kind of like, yeah, it's a dirty space and nobody wants to talk about it or touch it or clean it up, right? So some of those kinds of situations where it just feels bad and sometimes you can't even put your finger on it.
That was Dr. Kimberly Jones, founder and CEO of Covlux Corporation. Dr. Jones is a visionary leader with over 2 decades of experience in coaching, leadership, and personal development. With an extensive background in business psychology, law, and real estate, Dr. Jones brings a unique blend of skills and insight to every organization she serves. She is the creator of Heart Leadership, a transformative leadership style that emphasizes empathy, integrity, and emotional intelligence. As a coach, Dr. Jones applies Heart Leadership principles to help clients navigate their personal and emotional journeys, particularly those focused on relationships and love. Her coaching style emphasizes the importance of self-awareness, empathy, and authentic communication. She guides clients to build stronger, healthier relationships by fostering self-love and understanding, breaking down complex challenges into manageable parts, and developing effective communication strategies. Dr. Jones's coaching empowers individuals to embrace their true selves and cultivate meaningful connections with others. She holds a baccalaureate degree in psychology and anthropology a Juris Doctorate, and a PhD in business psychology. One thing we all tend to agree with is that toxic leaders have a tendency to also be bullies.
They need help with unpacking those issues and concerns. And there might be lots of different reasons. There might be things all the way back to their childhood that they've observed. There might be historic trauma. It's difficult to know. So those are things where somebody that's mentoring that leader should be engaged with them to notice it.
And that can look like a lot of different things, whether it be gaslighting, belittling, micromanaging, or talking down to someone. And sometimes that talking down has other forms. But something Kim said struck a nerve with me because it sounded so familiar, only she was able to put words to it.
Communication violence. So you can pick up on those little nuances in communication that people don't call it that, but it really should be described as that, where it's just violent, where you are talking to somebody in a way that is just totally disrespectful. You would never talk to a stranger that way. In some situations, people communicate in ways that are literally aggressive. And so it came from the theory of a gentleman who explored that and then created foundation around it.
Communication violence. I'm going to encourage you all to dig deeper into that one. I, for one, worked for someone who had mastered her communication violence skills. In fact, she was best known for her ability to break a person down using just her words. And sometimes it's more than that, as if that in and of itself isn't a big enough problem or a big enough red flag. There are way more than one might think.
Some of the things I'll look for in a manager is high turnover. That's one of the number one things. Why are people leaving? Unless it's a high turnover kind of position, like child welfare, where you're ongoing, like you're doing something that there's burnout very quickly or something like that. That's something that you expect. But if it's not that, you can find out if there's high turnover pretty quickly at lunch or somewhere where people are chatting, or that people are never taking lunch, or there are certain policies that exist that make it difficult for people to live. So those are some of the toxicity. I once had a manager that wouldn't let people leave the building for lunch. I think that's even illegal. But those kinds of things where you're like, really? Like, we're all adults. You telling me I can't leave?
The shameful part is red flags sometimes are all too plentiful.
Lack of transparency is huge, where you just don't know what's going on and you can't ask. You're in a situation where you're not allowed to ask. And if you do, there's punitive, either outright punitive and write you up and things of that nature, or literally things are taken away and and you can feel that that's happening.
Sometimes our gut feeling doesn't kick in soon enough, and we find ourselves surrounded by people who are disengaged and emotionally shut off. And in doing so, we find ourselves at the epicenter of a storm from which we can find little shelter.
It's the reality of like feeling the energy of somebody and being like, this feels great, or this feels weird, or this feels bad, or I'm not sure yet.
Imagine walking into a job that feels like it's at the cutting edge of changing the world, revolutionizing healthcare. That's how Tyler Schultz felt when he first joined Theranos, a fresh Stanford graduate with a degree in biology. Tyler was excited to be part of this startup that promised to make healthcare cheaper, faster, and more accessible. Elizabeth Holmes helmed the company. The company's young, charismatic CEO had convinced the world that Theranos' technology could perform hundreds of tests with just a few drops of blood. It was the future of medicine, and Tyler, like many others, wanted to be part of that future. But things didn't take long to feel, off. When Tyler started working in the company's lab, he quickly realized that the technology wasn't working as advertised. The blood tests were inconsistent. The data wasn't adding up. Theranos' proprietary machines, which were supposed to be revolutionary, were producing faulty results. Instead of addressing these issues, the company was using third-party machines to run many of the tests, machines that they weren't supposed to be relying on. But here's the thing, Tyler didn't act right away. Despite seeing these red flags, he brushed them aside. Why? For one, he was deeply committed to the company's vision. Theranos wasn't just another startup. It was on a mission to transform healthcare. The idea of improving lives with just a few drops of blood was powerful. And like many employees, Tyler was drawn to that mission. He didn't want to believe that the company he admired so much could be built on false promises. It was easier to rationalize the problems as just growing pains, the kinds of issues any new technology faces in its early stages. But it wasn't just the vision that kept Tyler from acting. There was a more personal reason too. His grandfather, George Shultz, yes, that George Shultz, the former U.S. Secretary of State, was on Theranos' board of directors. George Shultz was a respected public figure and one Elizabeth Holmes' most ardent supporters. This family connection weighed heavily on Tyler. How could he now blow the whistle on the company that his own grandfather believed in so deeply? Still, the red flags were piling up. Lab results for critical tests for conditions like HIV and pregnancy were inaccurate. Patient health was at risk. Employees were being siloed, kept in the dark about other teams' work, and communication was tightly controlled. Despite his growing discomfort, Tyler didn't speak up immediately. There was a culture of fear at Theranos. Employees were scared of retaliation. People were fired for asking too many questions. Even when Tyler raised concerns internally, they were dismissed or ignored. At this point, it wasn't just about the science not adding up. It was about an environment where secrecy reigned, where questions weren't welcome, and where dissent was seen as betrayal. Tyler knew something had to change, but the stakes were high. He wasn't just challenging his employer, he was potentially going against his own family. The relationship with his grandfather weighed heavily on him. George Shultz was a believer in Holmes and Theranos, and Tyler knew that exposing the truth would drive a wedge between them. And yet, the company was crossing ethical lines. It was putting patients at risk. The technology didn't work, and the public didn't know. After several failed attempts to get internal leadership to take his concerns seriously, Tyler made the difficult decision to blow the whistle. He reached out to John Carreyrou, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, who had already begun looking into Theranos. Tyler's decision to speak to the press was pivotal. It was the beginning of the end for Theranos. As Carreyrou's investigation gained momentum, the truth unraveled. Theranos was a house of cards, and when it fell hard. But Tyler's whistleblowing didn't come without personal cost. His relationship with his grandfather was strained, with George Shultz siding with Holmes at first. Theranos' legal team aggressively pursued Tyler, trying to silence him. They even pressured his family. It was a tense, isolating time, but Tyler stood by his decision and his conviction. In the end, Tyler's courage helped to expose one of the biggest corporate frauds in recent history. His story is a reminder that even when red flags are glaring, there can be immense personal and professional barriers to acting on them. Tyler ignored those red flags at first, as many of us might in a similar situation. But ultimately, the weight of the truth and his ethical responsibility became impossible to ignore. More on this after the break. Part 2, in which we find an absolution. Tyler Shultz's experience at Theranos highlights the complexity of recognizing and addressing red flags in toxic environments. His story shows how difficult it can be to speak up, especially when personal loyalty, professional ambition, and family dynamics are at play. But in the end, his decision to act not only brought down a fraudulent company, but also protected countless patients from harm. Take the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York, for example, during 2021. You'd think a luxury brand like the Ritz-Carlton would have employees who are eager to stay, but that wasn't the case. Staff left in droves, citing toxic management and unrealistic expectations. Some employees said their mental health concerns were completely dismissed during the pandemic, while others pointed to obvious favoritism. Behind the scenes, a toxic culture was forcing people out, despite the hotel's shiny exterior. And if you were just looking at the brand from the outside, you'd have no idea the company was bleeding talent. Reading about what happened at Theranos and the Ritz-Carlton nearly gave me PTSD. Because that's the situation I found myself in, sans the fanciness of the Ritz-Carlton. But I found myself surrounded by a leader who essentially put on a show for corporate leaders or auditors or other stakeholders, pretending like we were one big happy family. And all the while, I would look around the room during a meeting with corporate team members or audit exit conferences wondering, what if someone just went off script and told the truth? What if someone dared to speak out? My one regret is that I waited as long as I did. I was in a situation where there was an expectation that you would stand there or sit there and she would tee up the conversation and you were expected to say exactly what was scripted. The funny part is, during one of these exit conferences, I was sitting behind her and I could see her actually reading from a script she'd written. It was so well rehearsed and we were all complicit. We stayed quiet. We played our part. Maybe it was because no one wanted to rock the boat, or maybe everyone was afraid for their jobs. Our complicity, it kept people in harm's way. My complicity kept people in harm's way. But then something happened that changed my entire mindset. Something happened that opened my eyes to what was happening right in front of me. And it was as if the world came flooding into view all at once. It was Maverick, my dog. Maverick died on April 9th, 2024. That was the day the magic died, the day the music died, the day my entire world came to a screeching halt. Maverick was only 8, but it was the best 8 years of my life. He loved me unconditionally. He waited for me every single day, and every day when I got home, he showed me what it meant to be loved. He made the hard days worth it. No matter what was going on in life or at work, I always knew when I came home, Maverick would make things better. And then, out of nowhere, I found myself not tolerating people with totalitarian attitudes. Partly, I was mad, angry even, that Maverick no longer got to exist in a world where someone so mean and so rude got to exist free of charge. It wasn't fair. And since I could no longer go home to Maverick, I knew my days were numbered. Recognizing red flags in the workplace isn't always easy. Sometimes they blend into the background, becoming part of the everyday noise. But if we take the time to notice them, whether it's high turnover, poor communication, or an overall negative atmosphere, we can start to make real change. At the end of the day, it's about creating a workplace where people can thrive, where transparency and trust are the norm, not the exception. And it starts with each of us, whether we're in leadership or just starting out, to recognize the red flags and take action. Without Maverick, I knew on my worst days, I would come home and it would just be me, my thoughts, and an empty house. The love that was waiting on me would not be there. The respite between battles was gone. I was on my own. And I was left with a very limited number of choices, and quite frankly, none of them were good.
Two-pronged. I'm a two-pronged kind of person. So I am either stay but with some caveats, or devise an exit plan and choose to leave. And those are the two options. I do not think you stay in a toxic work environment. I think that life is too short, and you probably need to explore your talents elsewhere if it is an actual constant toxic space. For people who are in toxic situations where they really can't get out of it, it is reasonable to start the process of trying to do a leave, to find yourself, just leave the environment. And that means quitting.
In a nutshell, I did quit. But the things that happened leading up to that were far more complex and much more nuanced. In the coming episodes, I'll guide you through exactly what that looked like. And not just that, you'll get an understanding of its significance. In the words of Rudyard Kipling, I keep 6 honest men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are why and what and when and how and where and who. Some people say some stones are better left unturned. I say, to hell with those people. My name is JD Hyman. This is the Hyman Podcast. I'll see you next time. This episode of the Hyman Podcast was written, directed, and produced by myself, JD Hyman. Additional research and story development by Whitney Hall, Sherith Guest, and Mary Louise Layton. Kevin Aki developed our branding with additional graphic design by Grant Furness. Jim Yosef produced and mixed our theme song, Canary, with additional music licensed by Epidemic Sound. This episode of the Hyman Podcast was produced in conjunction with the Press Play Podcast Network. Chase Smith serves as CEO. I oversee operations. Brooks May is the Chief Creative Officer. Danny Edgington is Head of Sales, and Michael Sayos is the Chief Sound Engineer. To learn more about the network, sponsorships, guest appearances, or if you're interested in launching your own podcast on our network, visit us on the web at www.pressplaypodcast.com. To learn more about this podcast, our mission and vision, as well as your sponsors, please visit us on the web at www.jdhyman.com.